Wow. Okay, we thought we were going deep before, but this is a whole other level of deep dive. You want to explore the history of religion and violence.
A fascinating and perpetually relevant topic.
You got that right.
Hmm.
But the source material you sent over, this book excerpt, it's like diving into the history of violence itself. I mean, from ancient Sumer to, well, just about everywhere, humans have set up shop, formed societies.
It's a bit like looking for a lost city and you stumble on a whole civilization, isn't it?
Exactly. Okay, so where? Where do we even begin? We're talking thousands of years of history here. Where do we start?
Let's start with a revolution.
Okay.
The agricultural revolution, to be precise, it's a common misconception that humans were always inherently violent. We weren't always waging war on a massive scale.
Right. Our cave-dwelling ancestors weren't exactly peaceful, but it was more about immediate survival, right?
Yeah.
Stealing a meal, defending the cave, that sort of thing.
Exactly. But then agriculture comes along, and suddenly we're not just, hunting and gathering, we're producing a surplus.
Okay.
And that surplus, that's where things get interesting.
Because now there's something to fight over.
Precisely. Look at Jericho, one of the earliest settlements we know of. Around 9000 BC, thanks to agriculture, they've got this stockpile of food, which makes them a target. Other groups would have killed for that kind of security.
Makes sense. So does that mean civilization is inherently violent?
Not necessarily, but it definitely changes the game. See, before agriculture, power was, well, it was much more fluid, more about personal strength or influence. But with a surplus, with something to control, something to protect, you start to see the rise of elites, of kings and rulers. And to maintain that control, they needed something more than just brute force. They needed a system of justification, a way to legitimize their rule.
So religion was used to, what, like maintain order?
Precisely. It's fascinating how the Sumerian elite, for example, used religion to their advantage. Their gods weren't these, distant, all-loving beings. They were more like superpowered humans, mirroring their own earthly hierarchy, just as power-hungry, really.
Okay, so I see where you're going with this. It's like saying, hey, if the gods rule through power and might, then, well, it's only natural, even divinely ordained, for kings to do the same, right?
Exactly. It was a brilliant, albeit rather cynical move. And you see this pattern repeating, well, throughout history. New technology, like agriculture, creates a surplus, which inevitably leads to a struggle for control. A struggle often won through force and justified through, well, whatever means available.
And religion, unfortunately, became a very powerful tool in that struggle.
Sadly, yes. But it's not always about controlling food, you see. It's about land, expansion, and the belief systems that fuel these conquests.
See, that's what gets me about history. It's never as simple as we think, is it?
Not at all. In fact, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's move from settled societies to, well, the nomads who often challenged them. Groups like the Indo-Europeans, who brought with them a whole new perspective on, well, on violence. We're talking about a warrior ethos that was deeply embedded in their culture and one that has had a lasting impact.
Yeah, whenever I hear about ancient warriors, I think of, you know, epic battles, heroic deeds. But you're suggesting there's more to it than that.
Much more. These were incredibly tough people, shaped by a life of constant migration, conflict. But if you look closely at their stories, like the Iliad, for example, you'll see it's not all glory and victory. There's also a deep sense of sadness, a recognition of the, well, you could say, the heavy cost of this lifestyle.
So they celebrated their warriors, but also mourned them.
Precisely. And this brings us to another fascinating example. The Vedic people in India, their early rituals, they were all about physical prowess, displays of strength, often linked to, warfare, almost like they were trying to channel this warrior energy, this inherent violence, into something, well, something structured, something meaningful.
So they were aware of this potential for violence and trying to, I don't know, contain it, control it.
That's a great way to put it. And what's fascinating is that as these societies become more settled, as they transition from, nomadic life to establishing kingdoms, you see this conscious effort to shift away from overt violence in their rituals, like they were trying to internalize that warrior spirit.
Instead of conquering others, they were conquering themselves.
That's an interesting way to think about it. But what about other parts of the ancient world? Did they have these same struggles with violence?
They did, although it often manifested in different ways. Take ancient China, for example. They offer a contrasting perspective on civilization itself. While other cultures saw it as a way to tame, nature, the Chinese saw it as a way to tame human nature.
That's right. It wasn't about conquering the natural world. It was about imposing order on our own animalistic instincts.
Exactly. And this brings us to another key player in this story, the ruler. In the Chinese worldview, the ruler wasn't just a king, they were almost a sage, responsible for guiding their people toward a more civilized, harmonious existence. So instead of justifying their power through divine right, like the Sumerians, they were seen as the source of order itself.
Precisely. But that doesn't mean their society was utopian. In fact, the Shang dynasty, one of the earliest Chinese dynasties, was incredibly militaristic.
And they had a very rigid social hierarchy, with a sharp divide between the elite and the peasant farmers who worked the land.
Yes, and this is where that darker side of civilization comes into play. Despite their emphasis on harmony and order, even the Chinese, they fell prey to the temptation of dehumanization. Peasant farmers, the backbone of their society, they were seen as almost subhuman. They were kept separate from the cities, their labor exploited to maintain the lavish lifestyle of the ruling class.
It's a stark reminder that even in a society built on the idea of controlling human nature, violence can still find a way to rear its ugly head.
And sadly, this idea that some humans are less civilized, less deserving of respect or dignity, it's a theme we see throughout history. It's a theme that often goes hand in hand with violence, both physical and systemic.
You mentioned earlier that violence wasn't always about controlling resources. Sometimes it's about land, about expansion. And that makes me think of a group we haven't talked about yet, the Israelites. Their story, as depicted in the Bible, is all about escaping violence, finding a new home.
You're right. That desire for a promised land, a place free from oppression, it's a powerful motivator. And it ties directly into your initial interest in this complex relationship between religion and violence. So, shall we explore that a bit further?
Absolutely. Let's dive in. So we're talking about the Israelites, people who fled violence and oppression in Egypt, searching for a new home, a promised land. You'd think they'd want to escape violence to break free from that cycle. But, well, it doesn't quite work out that way, does it?
It's a tragic irony, really. Their story, as it's depicted in the Bible, it's full of conquests, of battles fought and lands seized. Seems escaping violence doesn't necessarily erase it from a people's story.
Yeah. So how do we reconcile this? They were fleeing oppression, yet they ended up subjugating others.
It's complicated, and I think it's here that we see how religion can be used, not just to justify, existing power structures, but also to legitimize the acquisition of power. The Israelites believed they were God's chosen people, destined to inherit the land. And that belief, as sincere as it might have been, it fueled a great deal of conflict.
It's like what we were talking about earlier with the Sumerians using their gods to legitimize their rule. The Israelites believed they were carrying out God's will, even if it meant, waging war.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that the Bible itself isn't, some neutral historical document. It was written, edited over centuries, shaped by the very events it describes. The narratives we read today, they reflect the worldview of those who compiled them, who may have had a vested interest in portraying, say, the Israelites' conquests in a certain light.
So when we read about, the Israelites' battles with the Canaanites, for example, we're not just reading about ancient history. We're engaging with a narrative that's been shaped and reshaped over time.
Exactly. It's a reminder that history is never truly objective. It's always filtered through the lens of those who write it.
Makes you wonder about the stories we tell ourselves today, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How we frame our own actions, our own beliefs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, let's get back to the timeline. We've talked about ancient civilizations, but this tension between religion and violence, it doesn't disappear with the rise of, empires, does it?
Not at all. In fact, it takes on new and often more complicated forms. Let's consider the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity. Initially, Christianity was a religion of the oppressed, a movement that challenged Roman authority. But that dynamic shifted dramatically with Emperor Constantine.
Right. He embraced Christianity and made it the official religion of the empire.
And that's where things get really interesting. Because now you have an empire, a vast and powerful empire, with religion at its very heart. And with that comes a whole new set of questions.
Like, who gets to define what it means to be Christian? And what happens when those in power use religion to further their own goals?
Exactly. And unfortunately, history provides us with some rather sobering answers. We see the rise of religious persecution, of wars fought in the name of God.
The Crusades, for example.
Exactly. But it's not just about these, these large-scale conflicts like the Crusades,
Hmm.
we also see violence on a smaller scale, often directed at those deemed, well, heretical, blasphemous.
Like the Spanish Inquisition.
Precisely. And this brings us to another crucial point, the Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, while a movement aimed at, reforming the church, it also unleashed this wave of violence and instability across Europe.
The 30 Years' War, for example. A conflict fueled in part by religious differences that absolutely, well, it ravaged Europe.
And this brings us to a fascinating, albeit perhaps unexpected connection to your initial question about religion and violence. Let's talk about the American Puritans.
Okay, this should be good. The Puritans, those folks who sailed across the Atlantic to escape religious persecution and establish a godly society in the New World.
Indeed. But even their story, a story seemingly driven by a desire for peace and religious freedom, is intertwined with, well, with violence.
In what way? I mean, they weren't exactly known for their militarism.
True. But their very presence in the New World, their displacement and often brutal treatment of Native Americans, it speaks to a different kind of violence, a violence rooted in the belief that they were, well, that they were God's chosen people, destined to, you could say, to tame this new land.
So their piety, their belief in a divinely ordained mission, it blinded them to the humanity of those already living here.
In a sense, yes. They saw themselves as bringing civilization, enlightenment to a savage land. And tragically, that belief often justified their actions.
It's like what happened with the Israelites all over again, isn't it? History repeating itself.
It's a sobering thought. And it underscores the fact that even those fleeing violence, those seeking to create a more perfect society, can become entangled in the very cycles they sought to escape. But perhaps even more intriguing is how the Puritan story also sows the seeds for a very different worldview, one that will eventually challenge the role of religion in public life.
You're talking about the rise of secularism, right?
Exactly. The Puritans, in their quest for religious freedom, unintentionally paved the way for a separation of church and state. Quite the paradox.
Yeah, that is fascinating. So they were trying to build a society centered around their faith, but in doing so, they helped create a world where religion eventually took a backseat to, well, secular power.
You could say that. But of course, the transition from a world, dominated by religion to a more secular one, it was hardly peaceful.
Right. The French Revolution comes to mind.
Exactly. The storming of the Bastille, the Reign of Terror, a period of immense upheaval and bloodshed.
Right.
And while not directly caused by religion, the French Revolution did see a backlash against the church, which was seen as being, well, complicit in the old corrupt order.
It's almost like humanity was trying to figure out a new way to organize itself, to find meaning and purpose in a world where religion was no longer the dominant force.
And as we'll see, that search for meaning, for a new foundation upon which to build a just and equitable society, it wouldn't be without its own share of challenges, and tragically, its own forms of violence.
Wow, this is heavy stuff. Okay, so we've journeyed from ancient Sumer to the French Revolution, and it seems like we've only scratched the surface of this intricate relationship between religion and violence.
Indeed. And as we delve into the more recent past, we'll see how this dynamic continues to shape our world in profound and often unsettling ways.
Okay, you know what? Before we go there, I need a minute to process all this and maybe some of those cookies you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Then let's jump into the 20th century and see what lessons we can glean from this tangled web of history. All right, I'm back. Cookies devoured, ready to tackle the 20th century. I have to admit, after that last segment, I'm a little nervous about what we'll uncover.
Understandable. The 20th century is it's often touted as this triumph of secularism, a world leaving behind, the religious conflicts of the past. But as we'll discover, even with religion seemingly sidelined, humanity, we found new ways to unleash violence on a scale never seen before.
It's almost like we replaced one set of justifications for another,
Mm-hmm.
Instead of divine right or holy wars, we had ideologies like nationalism, communism.
You've hit upon a crucial point. These secular ideologies, often promising these utopian visions, they proved just as capable of horrific violence as any religious conflict. In fact, you could argue that they tapped into something even more primal, a kind of tribalism that transcended, traditional religious boundaries.
And the really scary part is how these ideologies, they use the language of science, of progress, to justify their actions.
Exactly. Take the rise of eugenics, for example. Here you had this movement cloaked in the language of science that sought to, Well, to improve the human race.
Mm.
Through selective breeding, it led to forced sterilizations, even genocide,
Yeah.
all in the name of creating a more fit society.
It's chilling how easily these ideas, well, they took hold, even in supposedly, enlightened nations.
And this brings us to one of the most, well, disturbing aspects of 20th century violence, the use of technology to wage war on an unprecedented scale. World War II, with its atomic bombs, its mechanized death camps, it showed just how destructive humanity could be when driven by fanaticism and armed with the tools of, modern
It's
science.
almost as if we'd created a world where violence was more, I don't know, more efficient, more impersonal.
Precisely. And this trend, this reliance on technology to distance ourselves from the human cost of violence, it doesn't end with World War II. Think of the Cold War, where the threat of nuclear annihilation hung over the world for decades, or the more recent wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, where drone strikes have become, well, a chillingly common tactic.
So what happens next? Where do we go from here? I mean, after exploring centuries of violence, it's hard to feel optimistic about the future. Does religion offer any solutions?
It's interesting you ask that. As we move into, well, the late 20th and early 21st centuries, we see this resurgence of religion in public life. Some scholars argue that this is a reaction to the very secularism that we've been discussing.
A reaction to the violence, the perceived moral decay of the modern world. People seeking, I don't know, solace, meaning
Yeah.
in these traditional faiths.
Exactly. And this resurgence, it takes many forms. You have the rise of, say, fundamentalist movements within various religions, each with its own, interpretation of scripture, and often a more rigid, uncompromising worldview.
Like the Islamic Revolution in Iran, for example.
Yes, a powerful example.
Yeah.
But it's not just about, fundamentalism. You also see more moderate forms of religious engagement in politics, often focused on social justice issues.
So religion is still a powerful force in the world, capable of both great good and, as we've seen, great harm.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to your initial question. What is the relationship between religion and violence? And I think the answer is, well, it's far more nuanced than we might have initially thought. It's not a simple case of, religion causing violence or vice versa. It's about how these forces interact, how they shape and are shaped by historical circumstances, power dynamics, and even individual beliefs.
So where does that leave us? If there's no easy answer, I mean, what are we supposed to do with all of this information?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If anything, I hope this deep dive has shown that understanding the past, wrestling with its complexities, it's crucial if we want to create a better future. We need to be aware of how easily we can be drawn into these cycles of violence, how even the best intentions, well, they can have unintended consequences.
There's a lot to think about, that's for sure. But you're right, understanding the past, especially this tangled history of religion and violence, it is crucial if we want to break free from those cycles and create a more peaceful, a more just world.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And who knows? Maybe by understanding the forces that have driven us apart, we can start to build bridges of understanding, empathy. It's a daunting task, but as history has shown us, humans are capable of incredible things, both good and bad. The choice ultimately is ours.
Well, that's a powerful thought to end on. So to our listener out there, we leave you with this. As you grapple with these complex issues, remember that history isn't just a collection of dusty old stories. It's a living, breathing thing. That continues to shape our present and our future.